All right, we're back for another episode. I'm Mr. Decker,
And I'm Mr. Jewett.
and today we are talking about the state of Maine and the Great Depression.
Yeah, so a lot of different areas in the United States were hit very differently, depending on where they were, what kind of economy they had, and Maine was definitely no exception to that.
Right. Maine was one of those states that was in kind of a unique position for the Depression because we weren't a very industrial state in comparison to like the Pennsylvania states, things like that. And although we grew a lot of crops, it wasn't affected by the Dust Bowl because that primarily hit Kansas. So, because of that, um, the Depression doesn't hammer Maine in 1928 29 like it does kind of the other states. But that doesn't necessarily mean things are going well.
No, there are a lot of things in Maine that takes a hit because of the Great Depression, and it doesn't happen right at the beginning of the Great Depression. It takes a couple years for it to really hit here, in Maine in the northern United States. Some things, our economy was based mostly on our natural resources, and we still see that today. We had then and we have now a lot of fishing industries. We have a lot of lumber, and we also have a lot of agriculture, whether it's potatoes or blueberries or whatever else we grow here in Maine.
Right. And so Maine's combination of what we kind of grew and produced and the fact that we were a very poor state anyway meant that for a lot of people in Maine, the Depression didn't necessarily change a whole lot. I mean, the New York Times describes Maine's situation in 1931 as not particularly abnormal and kind of described the Great Depression as the way things had already been in the state of Maine. So, I mean, if you already are really poor and like hunting for your food and only relying on things that you can grow in your own garden for food, like the depression and what happens in New York doesn't matter to you because you weren't investing money anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we did still see some things that took a fall for a little bit. Like potato prices dropped pretty substantially. It was almost at one point we couldn't actually grow enough and I don't know what you call them, picking potatoes,
Yeah, it says bushels.
bushels. Yeah, so you can't even gather enough potatoes to sell, and then offset the price of gas that it would cost to transport these potatoes to where you would sell them.
Right.
So there was some issues. We had a lot of competition from Canada with their lumber industry, um, but that's just one of those things about Maine, though, is we're kind of stubborn.
Yeah, Mainers don't change. We don't change our ways. We don't generally accept lots of help. Um, Mainers look at the world as something that they need to kind of self-sustain and conquer. And I mean, we had been kind of having to deal with Canadian competition and losing that battle, sort of the lumber industry and things being produced more cheaply in other places that can grow things all year long and that sort of problem. So definitely a lot of the problems that were hitting Maine during the Depression were probably going to come to Maine anyway, and the Depression kind of sped them up.
Um, but yeah, do you want to talk about now how the New Deal starts to affect us here in Maine?
Yeah, so first problem, people in Maine didn't want the New Deal. Kind of a weird thing to say. They saw the New Deal as the government trying to tell them how to change their lives and go out and control things for them. And they're basically a lot of the idea was it's easier for three generations of our family to live in the same house and struggle to survive. Like we'd rather do that than accept a government job or accept help from the government in any way.
Yeah, I mean, I've always kind of been that way just myself. Even though it's almost 100 years later, like I'm I don't really like to take help, accept help from people. Like I would much rather do something myself and then go help someone else with something they're trying to do than accept help from someone else for me. It's just kind of how I was raised, I guess. But that's just part of the Mainer spirit.
Yep. But I mean, eventually you get to the point where um, you gotta do something. For example, I have a lot of family. We're based from like Fort Kent, Eagle Lake area up in northern Maine. My great grandfather was one of like 7 or 8 children, and it's hard to feed 7 or 8 children. So some of the kids worked in like the Civilian Conservation Corps, where you would be sent to basically it was like a barracks, but instead you were building things, or in this case, driving logs down the Penobscot River, and the government would feed you so your family didn't have to, and the money that you made would go home to your family. And he actually did that.
Yeah, and they the CCC and there was other of those alphabet soup agencies that affected Maine and helped Mainers out. Um, but one of the other things the CCC did was they wanted to help prevent forest fires, and one of the best ways to do that is create paths through the woods that are 100 to 200 feet wide, just of no trees and no brush, and these were called fire paths, fire lanes. And these members of the CCC, in order to get those logs down the river, that's how they cut. And you today, we still see those effects because some of those ended up becoming part of our Appalachian Trail.
Yep.
So if you go up into northern Maine, you look at, well, I wouldn't call it way northern, not like Fort Kent, but you look at the Greenville area. There's something called the 100-mile Wilderness that goes into Baxter State Park. Like that section of Maine, that happened during the Great Depression. That was a government-funded program to make that happen.
Yeah, Maine actually got a lot of real significant kind of benefits in terms of stuff. I guess I would describe it from the Great Depression. We'd mentioned the Tennessee Valley Authority bringing electricity to a lot of southern states. That's not really what we mean here, but in a similar way, like some of the big benefits of the Depression were these construction projects, or what they would do is they would rebuild public infrastructure and build new schools, or there were a lot of literacy programs that were put in place. A lot of people couldn't read back then, or they only spoke French instead of English, and they had to learn how to speak English and that sort of thing. I think you wanted to mention some golf courses, right?
Well, yeah, they're also just to put people to work. The cities of the time are actually going to pay people to go out and clear forests away and make them into what would eventually become golf courses. So, for example, you have the Portland Municipal Golf Course. Oh, I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head right now, but there's a golf course down there that was made in 1932, and that was made as a New Deal program.
Yep. And another thing which really continues to affect our area really heavily is the New Deal as we moved into preparing for wars potentially. They enlarged the Bangor airport into the Bangor International Airport and allow it to be big enough to accommodate heavy bombers, which is the reason that a lot of times if the president's flying in from Europe, he lands at Bangor International Airport because it's our northern and easternmost airport capable of accommodating planes that are the size of heavy bombers. And without the New Deal, we wouldn't have that.
And another thing that really picked up here in Maine, especially in the late 30s when the war was just starting, World War II that is, you look at BWI or BIW, Bath Iron Works, they started making a lot of these military ships for the Navy, and that became a huge moneymaker for the state of Maine, and it still is.
Yeah, it really, Bath Ironworks probably the most significant contributor in terms of a single business to Maine's economy. You can talk about different sectors of the economy that are huge, but that's millions and millions of dollars every year kind of punched through or pumped through Bath Ironworks. So a lot of the stuff about the state of Maine comes with the backlash that Maine gave towards the Depression or towards the New Deal in general. People wanted to be really self-sustaining and not take lots of help. but at the same time, we kind of really needed the help because of competition with Canada and people not breaking even and working out in the woods or work selling potatoes or things like that. So they didn't want the help, but it was kind of needed.
Definitely. And just like the rest of the United States, once World War II took off and we really dug our teeth in and, got to work in that, that's when, we kind of pulled ourselves out of the Great Depression.
Yep. Uh, Amazing how suddenly needing to produce weapons and ammo and food and stuff like that will inspire people and inspire the economy to get better. Whoever would have thought.
And rain.
Rain helps, oddly enough. Anyway, I think that's really all we had to talk about here. Right? I think that's everything.
Yeah.
You got anything?
No, I think that's it, Mr. Decker. So I'll start it. I'm Mr. Jewett,
And I'm Mr. Decker.
and we're signing off.
Tune in next week when we get into the end of the New Deal and sort of the beginning of World War II.
Mm-hmm.